Welcome to Globewise Entertainment. Today, we're diving deep into the wild world of 1970s British exploitation cinema, a decade that pushed boundaries, broke taboos, and shocked audiences like never before. From controversial themes to scenes that sparked outrage across the nation, these films didn't just entertain, they left scars on the cultural landscape. If you haven't already, make sure to hit that subscribe button and join our growing community of movie lovers. And don't forget, tell us in the comments which of these shocking films you think was the boldest of them all. 1. Deathline, 1972. The cannibal horror that haunted the underground. In 1972, British audiences were blindsided by Deathline, a gritty exploitation horror that dared to crawl into the darkest corners of London's underground. Directed by Gary Sherman, the film blended urban paranoia with grotesque cannibal horror, and it wasn't afraid to push boundaries. The story begins in the bustling tunnels of the London Underground, where commuters mysteriously vanish. But the shocking truth isn't a ghost story, it's something far more disturbing. Deep beneath the city, a group of tunnel workers were trapped decades earlier during a cave-in, abandoned by society and forced to survive through unspeakable means, cannibalism. The last surviving descendant, known chillingly as the Man, prowls the shadows, preying on unsuspecting passengers. What set Deathline apart from other horror films of its time was its brutal realism. The makeup effects were grotesque and raw, with lingering shots of decomposed bodies shocking audiences who were used to more tasteful British horror of the 60s. The infamous scene where Donald Pleasant's inspector stumbles upon a grim lair filled with corpses became a nightmare fuel for years. Censors had a hard time with this film. The raw depiction of cannibalism, human decay, and the haunting repetition of the line, "Mind the doors," sent chills through theaters, making it one of the most notorious exploitation films of the decade. In the US, it was released under the more sensational title Raw Meat, marketed almost like a forbidden snuff film to draw in grindhouse audiences. Despite its exploitative elements, the film was also deeply political, exposing class inequality and government negligence. The idea of the working poor literally being buried alive and forgotten in London's underbelly was a sharp metaphor that made the horror all the more powerful. Today, Deathline is remembered as one of the UK's boldest and most shocking exploitation films of the 1970s, a movie that blended gore, social commentary, and raw fear in a way few dared to attempt. It set the tone for the decade's obsession with underground horrors, proving that sometimes the scariest monsters aren't supernatural at all, they're the ones society chooses to forget. 2. Exposé, 1976. The controversial British shocker, Exposé, 1976, a film so notorious, it became one of the infamous video nasties during the UK censorship wars of the 1980s. Directed by James Kenelm Clarke, the movie starred Udo Kier, Linda Hayden, and cult icon Fiona Richmond, blending psychological tension with the grimy aesthetics of 1970s exploitation cinema. At its core, Exposé follows a reclusive novelist struggling with writer's block who hires a secretary to help him with his manuscript. But what begins as a professional arrangement quickly spirals into paranoia, manipulation, and shocking violence. What truly set Exposé apart, and pushed it straight into controversy, was its unflinching approach to sex and brutality. Unlike mainstream thrillers of the time, this film presented raw psychological games and graphic encounters that unsettled both critics and audiences. When the British Board of Film Classification, BBFC, reviewed Exposé, they demanded extensive cuts before it could even be released. Later, as home video exploded in the early 1980s, uncut copies of the film circulated underground, landing Exposé on the official Video Nasties banned list, right alongside titles like Cannibal Holocaust and I Spit on Your Grave. For years, the film was nearly impossible to find legally in the UK. Its reputation only grew because of this ban, cementing Exposé as one of the most infamous exploitation films of the 1970s. Today, While some view it as a disturbing relic of Britain's exploitation era, others see it as a fascinating example of how far filmmakers were willing to go in pushing boundaries, and how those very boundaries helped spark decades of debate over censorship and free expression. 3. House of Whipcord, 1974. The Prison of Fear. When it comes to 70s British exploitation cinema, House of Whipcord stands out as one of the most unsettling and controversial films of its time. Directed by Pete Walker, the master of low-budget shockers, the film dives deep into a world of twisted morality, punishment, and psychological terror. At the center of the story is a young French model, invited to what seems like a glamorous countryside retreat. But instead of luxury, she finds herself trapped inside a private prison run by a sadistic former judge and his equally cruel partner. Their mission? To correct women they deem immoral, through psychological torment, harsh discipline, and often brutal consequences. What made House of Whipcord so shocking was not just its grim setting, but its raw reflection of authoritarian control and society's obsession with morality. For audiences in the 1970s, the film was both terrifying and disturbingly believable, tapping into cultural fears about punishment, censorship, and the abuse of power. Despite, or perhaps because of, its controversial subject matter, the movie became a defining example of British exploitation cinema, combining suspense, horror, and social commentary. Its mix of gothic atmosphere, grim realism, and shocking themes helped cement Pete Walker's reputation as a provocateur who pushed boundaries far beyond what mainstream cinema dared to show. Even today, House of Whipcord is remembered as more than just a cheap thriller. It's a dark critique of authority, morality, and cruelty wrapped in the shocking aesthetics of exploitation film. 4. Killer's Moon, 1978. Few exploitation films from the 1970s are as bizarre, disturbing, and unforgettable as Killer's Moon. Released in 1978, this British cult shocker combined horror, thriller, and surrealist nightmare into something that still unsettles audiences to this day. The story follows a group of schoolgirls stranded in the Lake District after their bus breaks down. Seeking help, they stumble upon 4 escaped convicts from a psychiatric hospital. But these men aren't ordinary criminals. They've been subjected to experimental drug treatments that leave them permanently trapped in a dreamlike state, unable to tell fantasy from reality. This twisted premise becomes the backdrop for a terrifying ordeal. Dressed in eerie white pajamas, the killers roam the woods convinced they're inside a dream, which means, in their minds, nothing they do has consequences. What unfolds is a shocking series of assaults, violence, and psychological terror as the girls fight for survival in a nightmarish landscape where morality and reality have been completely stripped away. What made Killer's Moon so controversial was its unapologetic use of taboo themes, particularly sexual violence, presented with a surreal and almost art house style. The dreamlike logic of the killers, paired with the bleak isolation of the setting, gave the film a uniquely disturbing tone that critics condemned as exploitative, yet fans later praised as daring and unforgettable. Despite receiving backlash on release, and often being lumped in with the video nasties, moral panic of the early 80s, the film slowly gained cult status. Today, it's remembered not just for its shocking content, but for its strange atmosphere, its oddball mix of horror and surrealism, and its bold willingness to push boundaries that mainstream British cinema never dared to touch. Killer's Moon stands as a haunting reminder of just how far 1970s exploitation cinema was willing to go to provoke, disturb, and shock an audience. 5. Prey, 1977. The Alien Among Us. If there's one film that perfectly shows how 1970s British exploitation cinema blurred the line between sci-fi, horror, and social taboo, it's Prey, 1977. On the surface, it looks like a low-budget alien invasion flick, but what shocked audiences back then was how deeply unsettling and transgressive it turned out to be. The story follows an alien named Cater who arrives on Earth, disguised as a human. But he doesn't come in peace. His mission is to study humans as potential food for his species. Where does he end up? In the countryside, stumbling upon a secluded home shared by two women in a lesbian relationship. Instead of a typical sci-fi adventure, the film dives into voyeurism, manipulation, and predatory tension, making audiences squirm in their seats. What really unsettled 1970s viewers wasn't just the gore or the strange alien premise. It was the way Prey mixed horror with forbidden sexuality. The lesbian couple was portrayed in a time when mainstream British cinema avoided queer themes, and suddenly, exploitation cinema was dragging it right into the public eye, wrapped in blood-soaked science fiction. The aliens' disturbing infiltration of their relationship symbolized fears of outsiders, gender nonconformity, and even cannibalistic consumption, metaphors that were shocking for audiences at the time. Add in a claustrophobic setting, eerie atmosphere, and a finale that left people questioning what they just witnessed, and Prey carved its place as one of the strangest, boldest British exploitation films of the decade. Today, Prey is remembered less for its special effects and more for how it challenged cultural taboos in a raw, unapologetic way. It was the kind of movie critics dismissed, but underground audiences couldn't stop talking about. Exactly the formula that made British exploitation films legendary. 6. Frightmare, 1974. If there's one British exploitation film that truly earned its place in cinematic infamy, it's Pete Walker's Frightmare. Released in 1974, this low-budget shocker blended horror, psychological drama, and taboo-breaking violence in ways that mainstream audiences of the time were completely unprepared for. The story follows an elderly couple, Dorothy and Edmund Yates, who are seemingly harmless on the surface. But as the film unfolds, it's revealed that Dorothy has a horrifying secret. She is a cannibal with a compulsive urge to kill. What made Frightmare so disturbing was its willingness to push beyond traditional horror tropes. Instead of supernatural monsters or gothic castles, the terror comes from the seemingly ordinary home of a sweet grandmother figure who hides a taste for human flesh. Audiences in the UK were stunned. The violence was graphic, the themes were taboo, and the idea of a kindly old woman becoming a sadistic killer was both absurd and terrifying. Critics at the time called it tasteless, exploitative, and dangerous, but the controversy only fueled its cult reputation. Pete Walker, who had already built a reputation for his edgy exploitation films, used Frightmare to push the boundaries of censorship. With its mix of cannibalism, torture, and psychological manipulation, the film tapped into a cultural fear of what was lurking behind closed doors in seemingly respectable British households. Today, Frightmare is remembered as one of the most notorious British exploitation films of the 1970s. It shocked censors, split critics, and delighted horror fans who craved something raw, bold, and unapologetically unsettling. It's the kind of film that couldn't have existed without the rebellious spirit of 70s exploitation cinema, and that's why it continues to hold its twisted place in horror history. 7. Virgin Witch, 1972. The cult shocker Virgin Witch, 1972, a film that perfectly captures Britain's flirtation with the risque and the occult during the 1970s. At first glance, it plays like a typical low-budget drama. Two sisters arrive in London, chasing their dreams of becoming models. But soon, their glamorous new world takes a sinister turn when they're lured into a secret pagan coven. What starts as high fashion quickly spirals into hypnotic rituals, witchcraft initiations, and a clash between innocence and corruption. For 1972 audiences, Virgin Witch was nothing short of scandalous. It mixed the alluring world of the modeling industry with supernatural horror, a combination that was both taboo and irresistible. Censors at the time weren't sure whether to treat it as fantasy, horror, or just plain indecency. That uncertainty fueled its reputation, with critics calling it both shameless exploitation and a daring slice of counterculture cinema. What makes Virgin Witch stand out is how it mirrors the cultural anxieties of 1970s Britain, the crumbling of traditional values, the rise of sexual liberation, and the fascination with the occult. While mainstream films played it safe, this one leaned into shock, ensuring its place as a cult classic in British exploitation history. Even today, the film holds a strange charm. It's campy, eerie, and a time capsule of an era when cinema pushed the boundaries of what could be shown on screen, and audiences couldn't look away. 8. Straw Dogs, 1971. When Sam Peckinpah's Straw Dogs hit British cinemas in 1971, it wasn't just another thriller, it was an explosion of controversy that tore through audiences and critics alike. Starring Dustin Hoffman and Susan George, the film tells the story of an American mathematician and his young wife moving to a rural English village, only to face escalating hostility from the locals. What begins as uneasy tension spirals into one of the most shocking portrayals of violence ever put on screen. At its core, Straw Dogs pushed boundaries that British cinema had rarely dared to cross. Its raw depiction of masculinity, revenge, and a now infamous sexual assault scene ignited furious debate. Was Peckinpah exposing the ugliness of human nature, or exploiting it for shock value? For many viewers, the film was simply too much. Critics labeled it brutal, misogynistic, and even immoral, while others hailed it as a masterpiece of psychological realism. Censors battled over cuts for years, and Straw Dogs was effectively banned from home video in the UK for nearly 2 decades. When it finally re-emerged, uncut, in the early 2000s, audiences were stunned that a film nearly 30 years old could still provoke such visceral reactions. Today, Straw Dogs is remembered not just as a film, but as a cultural flashpoint, an example of how 1970s exploitation cinema blurred the line between art and obscenity. It shocked the nation then, and it continues to spark heated debates about violence, morality, and the role of cinema in confronting our darkest instincts. 9. Scum, 1979. When it comes to sheer controversy in British cinema, few films rattled the nation quite like Scum. Originally made as a BBC television play in 1977, the film was immediately banned from broadcast for being too violent and too disturbing. But director Alan Clark wasn't done. 2 years later, he reshot the project as a full-length feature film, and what hit theaters in 1979 was nothing short of explosive. Set inside a brutal British borstal, a reform school for young offenders, Scum pulls no punches in exposing the shocking levels of violence, racial tension, and institutional cruelty behind closed doors. Ray Winstone, in a breakout role, plays Carlin, a young inmate who rises through the ranks of the prison's violent hierarchy, eventually becoming the daddy of the institution. What made Scum so incendiary wasn't just its raw depiction of beatings, riots, and corruption, it was the infamous scenes of sexual assault and suicide that shook audiences to their core. Critics accused the film of glorifying violence, while others argued it was an unflinching exposé of Britain's failing correctional system. Either way, the outrage was so intense that Scum was slapped with heavy restrictions, cementing its reputation as one of the most shocking British exploitation films of the era. Yet, despite, or perhaps because of, the controversy, Scum has endured as a cult classic. It's studied in film schools, celebrated for Ray Winstone's powerhouse performance, and remembered as a fearless indictment of systemic abuse. In the end, Scum proved that exploitation cinema could also carry a powerful political message, one that Britain wasn't entirely ready to face in the 1970s. 10. The Devils, 1971. When it comes to shocking British cinema of the 1970s, no film caused more outrage, censorship battles, and public controversy than Ken Russell's The Devils, 1971. Based on Aldous Huxley's historical account The Devils of Loudun and adapted by playwright John Whiting, the film tells the disturbing true story of a 17th-century French priest, Father Urbain Grandier, played by Oliver Reed, who becomes entangled in a storm of religious hysteria, political corruption, and sexual repression. What set The Devils apart was its brutal honesty and unapologetic style. Ken Russell did not shy away from depicting graphic violence, nudity, and blasphemous imagery. One of the most infamous scenes, known as the Rape of Christ, featured a group of nuns, driven into madness, engaging in a frenzied orgy around a crucifix. Even though the sequence was heavily cut or outright banned in most countries, its mere existence cemented the film's reputation as one of the most dangerously subversive movies ever made. The British Board of Film Censors, BBFC, demanded severe cuts, and Warner Brothers hid the film away for decades. Critics were polarized. Some hailed it as a bold masterpiece exploring the abuse of power and religious fanaticism, while others dismissed it as pure exploitation disguised as art. Despite its troubled release, The Devils gained a cult following. Today, it's seen not just as an exploitation film but also as a fearless critique of institutional corruption and blind faith. Its shocking visuals and uncompromising themes ensured that it became a cinematic legend, one that Britain wasn't ready for in 1971, but that modern audiences now recognize as a daring, if disturbing, work of art. And that wraps up our look at 10 British 70s exploitation films that truly shocked the nation. These movies may have been controversial, censored, or even banned, but they left a mark that cinema history can't ignore. If you enjoyed this countdown, don't forget to subscribe to Globewise Entertainment for more deep dives into the untold stories of film history. Now it's your turn. Which of these shocking films do you think pushed the boundaries the most? Drop your pick in the comments below. We love hearing your thoughts. Until next time, keep exploring the movies they tried to hide from you, only here on Globewise Entertainment.